There's a moment, every single time, when you walk up to a car that's been forgotten. A car that was once somebody's pride. Maybe it hauled a family across the country. Maybe it carried kids to school, groceries from the store, a Christmas tree strapped to the roof. And then one day, for reasons nobody can fully explain, it just stopped. The engine went cold. The tires went flat. The world moved on. And the car stayed. What you're looking at right now has been sitting in a horse stall, surrounded by manure, buried under spiderwebs, slowly sinking into the earth, for longer than most people go between oil changes. It's a 1971 Chevelle station wagon. Full size. Old Detroit iron. And today, we're going to find out if it still has a heartbeat. Let's set the scene properly, because context matters with a car like this. The year was 1971. America was in the full, glorious swing of the muscle car era, but things were already beginning to shift. The big block era was being squeezed by insurance companies and incoming emissions regulations. Automakers were still building large, powerful automobiles, though. Big ones. Heavy ones. Cars that felt like they were poured from iron and wrapped in chrome. The Chevelle was one of those cars. Chevrolet's midsize platform had been a sales juggernaut throughout the late 1960s, and by 1971, it was available in everything from stripped-down pillared coupes to full-dressed convertibles. But the wagon, the family hauler, the one with the fold-down rear seat and the cavernous cargo area, that version of the Chevelle often gets overlooked, which is exactly what makes it interesting. This particular example has a history that's equal parts fascinating and heartbreaking. According to a comment that showed up online after a photo of the car went public, a neighbor recognized it immediately. Said the original owner was an older woman, a Texas lady who bought it new off the lot back in '71. She kept it for years. Took care of it. Loved it the way people loved cars back then, like a member of the family. Eventually, it passed to her son. And from there, the trail gets murky, the way these stories always do. Somewhere along the line, the wagon ended up on a television show about car restoration. The crew that picked it up lowered the suspension. Why, exactly, remains one of life's great mysteries. Bolted drag radials onto all four corners and stuffed a brand new crate engine under the hood. They rebuilt the transmission. They fired it up on camera, spun the tires a few times, and then, as television productions often do, they moved on. When that production company eventually folded, the wagon became part of a larger collection that was acquired wholesale. And it ended up here. In a horse stall. In the dark. A buddy of mine, we'll call him Tony, has had his eye on this thing for a while. He wants to buy it. But before he writes a check for anything, we both agreed, we need to know what we're actually dealing with. Does it run?
Can it stop?
Is there anything structurally wrong with it that's going to turn a bargain into a sinkhole? So the deal is simple. Pull it out. Clean it up. Make it go. Make it stop. Evaluate. That's the plan. Plans, of course, have a way of evolving. Getting the wagon out of its hiding spot is its own small adventure. The tires are partially flat. The neutral gear takes a moment to find, the kind of moment where you realize just how long it's been since anyone touched anything on this car. The transmission tunnel is covered in something you don't want to step in because, again, horse stall. But she rolls. That's the first good sign. Nothing's seized solid. The wheels turn. The chassis hasn't fused itself to the ground in protest. We drag it out into daylight for what might be the first time in a year, maybe longer, and get our first real look at what we're working with. The verdict on the bodywork, surprisingly decent. For a car that has lived most of its recent life outdoors and unloved, it's not as catastrophic as it could be. There are clearly areas that have been repainted, touch-ups that tell the story of small dents and minor collisions over the decades. But there's no catastrophic rust eating through the quarters. The bones are there. The interior? That's another story. The headliner has given up entirely, sagging down in great billowing folds like a circus tent in a rainstorm. Whatever upholstery once lined the door panels has seen better days. The smell is atmospheric. But the glass is intact, the gauges are all present, and the steering wheel is original, a big, thin-rimmed piece of 1971 Detroit design that you just don't see anymore. We tow the wagon down to the shop. And before anything mechanical happens, before we pop the hood or crawl underneath or start poking at wires, we do what any self-respecting restorer does with a genuinely filthy car. We wash it. Not a gentle rinse. A full, high-pressure, get-the-decades-off-it pressure wash that strips away the cobwebs, the road grime, the evidence of every bird that ever flew overhead with bad timing. And then, because the results are so encouraging and because curiosity gets the better of us, we go further. A proper exterior detail. Foam, mitts, clean water, drying towels. The works. What emerges from underneath the grime is a car that looks, while not perfect, genuinely presentable. The paint isn't show quality, but it's even. The color reads cleanly. You can see the shape of the car now, that long, low roofline, the wide flanks, the subtle styling details that made the Chevelle Wagons so visually distinct from the Ford Country Squire crowd across the aisle. We call it a night. Tomorrow we find out if it runs. Here's the thing about crate engines, they're optimists. They come from the factory or the engine builder fresh, tight, clean, and full of potential. They don't know they've been sitting in a horse stall. They don't care about cobwebs or neglect or the fact that no one has turned the key in 12 months. All they need is spark, fuel, and compression, and if everything is right, they'll fire up like they never stopped. This one is a 383 cubic inch stroker. A Blueprint Engine's crate motor, advertised at 436 horsepower. It's running a 10-to-1 compression ratio, Blueprint's own aluminum cylinder heads, a hydraulic roller camshaft with 230/236 duration specs, a dual-plane intake manifold, and a 750 CFM Holley carburetor on top. On paper, it's exactly the kind of setup that makes classic car enthusiasts nod slowly and say, yeah, that'll get it done. Based on everything we know about the history, TV show, parking lot burnouts, lights out, the engine probably has somewhere around 30 total miles on it. Most of those miles are tire smoke. This thing has essentially never been broken in. It was built, it was run briefly for entertainment purposes, and then it was abandoned. That's both good news and complicated news. Good news, the engine is essentially new. If we can get it running, we're not dealing with worn rings or tired bearings or any of the ailments that come from actual use. Complicated news. Sitting is its own form of abuse. Gasoline goes stale. Rubber deteriorates. Water finds its way into places it has no business being. The first discovery is ugly. One of the braided fuel lines is leaking. Not a weep, a spray. Ethanol-blended modern gasoline has a nasty habit of attacking the rubber innards of older braided hoses, breaking down the material until the line fails. Fuel is spraying across the engine bay. We shut it down immediately and swap the offending line for something new. New line in place, we try again. The engine cranks. It wants to catch. We can hear it almost starting, that promising chug of compression building, but it won't sustain. Something's still wrong. We pull the distributor cap and check for moisture.
Clean and dry.
We check for spark at the plug wires and find it, but weak. Noticeably faint. We pull out a voltmeter and check the voltage at the distributor while cranking. It reads 10.6 volts under load. That's at the low end, but technically it should be sufficient to fire. We grab a can of starting fluid as a diagnostic tool, not a solution, but a way to rule out fuel delivery as the problem. If the engine fires on starting fluid and won't run on the carbureted mixture, that tells us the issue is in the fuel system, not the ignition. We spray. We crank. The engine catches immediately on the starting fluid, revs briefly, dies when the ether runs out. Fuel problem. Confirmed. Here's what had happened. When gasoline sits for extended periods, especially in a carburetor, it undergoes a slow chemical change. The lighter volatile compounds evaporate. The heavier, gummy residues remain. Moisture from the atmosphere gets absorbed. What you're left with is a brown, varnish-like substance that shares almost nothing with the fresh gasoline it used to be. It won't atomize properly. It won't ignite reliably. It's not fuel anymore. It's just a problem. We drain the float bowls completely. With the bowls empty, we crank the engine briefly to pull fresh fuel up from the tank through the fuel pump. The filter inline fills with clean-looking gasoline, a promising sign that the tank itself, while old, hasn't turned into a complete disaster zone. We fill the bowls back up with fresh fuel. We prime the accelerator pump a few times to make sure the Venturi circuits have clean gasoline. We turn the key. The 383 wakes up. It starts rough, choked slightly, running on a secondary bowl that still has some of the old fuel in it, but it starts. The idle fluctuates as it burns through the last of the contaminated mixture, stumbling and smoothing in turns. But it's running. 12 months of silence, and it's running. As the engine warms and the old fuel clears, it begins to settle. The idle firms up. The exhaust note deepens into that distinctive American V8 rumble, that burbling, potato-potato rhythm that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up if you grew up around these cars. It's not smooth yet. The secondary bowl is still burning through compromise. But the engine is alive. We add coolant. The overflow tank is bone dry, which isn't ideal, and we let it warm up properly while we move on to the next problem. There's a saying in the car world: any fool can make a car go fast. Making it stop reliably, that's where the real engineering lives. The brakes on this wagon are, to put it diplomatically, a work in progress. The power steering, at least, turns out to be a simple fix. We fill the reservoir with fresh fluid, jack the front end off the ground, and work the steering wheel lock to lock repeatedly to bleed air out of the system. 10 minutes later, it steers with one finger. That's a win. Small, but real. The brakes, though, that's a different conversation. We fill the master cylinder reservoir, which was completely empty, in the rear chamber. We bleed what we can. We put it down on the ground and take it for a brief, cautious test drive around the property. The brakes do, technically, slow the car. If technically means with enough foot pressure to make your legs sore and your heart rate spike. There's a long, mushy travel before anything meaningful happens, followed by a sudden, grabbing firmness at the very bottom of the pedal stroke. That's the characteristic behavior of a brake booster that isn't doing its job. Either the booster itself has failed internally, or there's no vacuum supply reaching it. We make a note to check the vacuum line. But there's another problem emerging from underneath the car. When you lower a classic car as aggressively as this one was lowered, bad things happen to the relationship between the chassis and the exhaust system. The exhaust pipes, which were designed with a certain amount of clearance below the floor pan, now find themselves wedged uncomfortably close to things they were never meant to touch. In this case, the brake lines. More critically, the rear suspension geometry has been compromised in a way that matters a great deal when you're driving. The coil springs in the rear, which on a factory Chevelle Wagon provide the springing medium between the axle housing and the frame, are so compressed by the lowering that they've essentially lost their ability to do their job. There's almost no usable spring travel remaining. When you come to a stop, the rear end of the car does something unsettling. It rises up and then bounces back down with a heavy, metallic clunk. The springs are seating themselves over and over because they've lost their preload. When we jack the car up and pull the rear wheels, the springs nearly fall out of their perches on their own. They're compressed to the point where the spring pads can't hold them reliably. It's the automotive equivalent of a coiled spring mousetrap that's been sitting set for so long that it's lost its tension, except instead of a mousetrap, it's a 4,000-pound station wagon trying to handle corners. Fortunately, the universe provides. Buried in a storage container nearby is a set of replacement rear coil springs, the right diameter, the right height, the right spring rate for a car of this size and vintage. Not custom. Not trick billet coilovers. Just a correct, proper set of springs that will let the rear suspension do what it was designed to do. Tony, to his considerable credit, insists on doing this the hard way, without dropping the drive shaft, without disassembling the entire rear suspension, working the spring compressor by hand until the old springs come out and the new ones go in.
It takes longer than it needs to.
It involves some colorful language. It also works. With the new springs installed and the car back on the ground, the transformation in stance is immediate and remarkable. Where before the wagon squatted low and mean like something trying to hide its shame, it now sits with authority. The tail is up where it belongs. The rake, that classic American car stance where the front sits slightly lower than the rear, giving the whole car a sense of leaning forward into motion, is back. The tires, which had been scrubbing against the wheel wells and the exhaust pipes at every bump, now have breathing room. It looks like a car that wants to go somewhere. Time passes. Projects like this rarely happen in one continuous sprint. Life intervenes. Other cars demand attention. And so the wagon sat, this time, at least, in a proper shop instead of a horse stall, while Tony quietly kept chipping away at it during the downtime. When I come back to it 2 months later, the car I'm looking at has transformed considerably from the cobweb-draped relic we dragged out of the barn. The drag radials, those wide, sticky, rear-biased tires that made absolutely no sense on a station wagon unless you were planning to race it, which nobody seems to have been, are gone. In their place are Cooper Cobra GTs, a classic bias-look radial that's become a favorite among builders who want period-correct aesthetics with modern compound performance. Two 235-60-15s up front. Two 255-60s in the rear, giving the back end a slightly wider, more muscular footprint that works beautifully with the raised suspension. The tire shop also noticed something important while doing the swap. The front disc brake calipers weren't moving the way they should. Stuck pistons, seized slides, the kind of caliper deterioration that happens when a car sits long enough for the rubber boots to crack and moisture to infiltrate the hydraulic passages. New calipers went on. New brake booster went in. The wagon, by the time I climb back behind the wheel, is a fundamentally different machine than the one we nursed out of that barn. And yet, there are things about driving a car like this that no amount of preparation fully prepares you for. The interior rattles with the enthusiasm of a car that has, shall we say, some deferred maintenance remaining. Interior panels flex. The headliner sags in protest. The exhaust system, with its bizarre forward-mounted mufflers positioned directly under the driver, creates a resonance frequency that seems specifically designed to vibrate every loose fastener in the entire passenger compartment simultaneously. And the front suspension. Oh, the front suspension. The lower control arm bushings are, in a word, destroyed. Not worn. Not tired.
Destroyed.
The rubber that was supposed to isolate the control arms from the frame and provide a controlled pivot point has deteriorated to the point where the arms themselves have measurable play in multiple directions. Every road imperfection gets transmitted directly into the steering wheel. Every bump produces a corresponding shuffle through the front end. The car tracks straight on smooth pavement, but smooth pavement is increasingly a luxury in this country, and the moment you encounter a real-world road surface, the front suspension makes its feelings very clearly known. It needs a front-end rebuild. Ball joints, bushings, tie rod ends, probably sway bar links while everything is apart. It's not a surprise. The car has been sitting for the better part of a year, and who knows what the suspension looked like before that, but it's a real thing that will have to be addressed before this car is genuinely roadworthy. But here's the thing. When the road opens up, when you get out of the town and onto something with a long straight and nobody in front of you, and you put your foot into that 383, the Chevelle Wagon is a completely different animal. The Blueprint engine delivers its power in a smooth, confident wave that builds from idle to redline with no drama and no hesitation. It's not a race engine. It doesn't scream or shriek or demand to be wound out. It pulls. Long, authoritative, torque-rich pulls that settle you back in the seat and remind you that this is a 383 cubic inch American V8, and American V8s have been making this feeling available since before most of us were born. Because the front suspension is worn out and the rear shocks are past their prime, the body roll when you give it aggressive throttle is substantial. The whole car torques back under acceleration in a way that feels simultaneously dangerous and completely wonderful. It's a car that communicates. It tells you exactly what it's doing and exactly how close it is to the edge of its capability, and it does this not through electronics or driver alerts or haptic feedback through the steering wheel. It does it through physics directly in the seat of your pants. This is what people mean when they talk about driver engagement in classic cars. It's not the engagement of precision, it's the engagement of weight and momentum and consequence. You are steering 4,000 pounds of American steel with your hands and your instincts, and the margin for inattention is smaller than you might like, and somehow that makes every mile matter more. Let's talk about what this car actually is, now that we've seen it in motion. It's a project. That's the honest answer. It runs and drives, which puts it miles ahead of where it was 2 weeks ago. The engine is exceptional, genuinely one of the nicest aspects of the entire car. a fresh power plant in an aged chassis that gives the whole thing a slightly schizophrenic personality. Great heart. Questionable joints. The transmission shifts cleanly through all 3 gears. The power steering works perfectly now. The brakes, with the new calipers and booster, are functional, not impressive, but functional. The rear suspension, with its new springs, gives the car a proper stance and at least a reasonable approximation of ride quality. The rear axle ratio is a mystery wrapped in an inconvenience. The gearing is set up for highway cruising, with what feels like 2.56 or similar, which means that getting tire smoke from a standing start requires a brake torque technique rather than a simple left foot stomp. Not a deal breaker. Just a character note. The body, for a car this age with this kind of story, is genuinely encouraging. The Texas provenance, decades of dry air, minimal road salt, a grandmotherly owner who presumably kept it in a garage rather than parked in a snowbank, shows in the metal. The floors are solid. The frame rails are clean. The quarters have surface corrosion in the wheel wells, which is normal and expected, but there's no rot threatening the structural integrity of the car. What it needs to be a truly sorted driver, a complete front suspension rebuild. New shock absorbers all around. Some exhaust work to address the rattle situation and relocate those front-mounted mufflers to somewhere more sensible. Interior attention, at minimum a new headliner and some attention to the door panels. And a serious look at the braking system from end to end, because while the brakes work, they work in the way that a one-cylinder lawnmower engine technically works. Technically, but not with any surplus confidence. Here's the thing about the Chevelle Wagon that you don't fully appreciate until you've spent some time with it. In a world full of Chevelle SS coupes and two-door hardtops and convertibles commanding serious money at auction, the wagon is still just a car. People pass them over. They're not the glamorous body style. They didn't appear in the muscle car movies. Nobody had a poster of one on their bedroom wall, which is exactly why they're interesting. Because the platform is the same. The engineering is the same. The suspension geometry, the steering, the brake architecture, the powertrain options, all of it carries over from the more celebrated versions. You can build a Chevelle Wagon into something genuinely remarkable, and when you pull up next to the guy in the coupe at a stoplight, you're driving something that's simultaneously familiar and unexpected. The car people expect to see carrying camping gear is instead moving with intent and purpose. There's a vision taking shape in the back of my mind for what this car could become. It involves proper coilovers, big brakes, maybe a disc conversion out back to match the discs up front, wide, period-correct wheels with enough tire to give the chassis something to push against. The engine and transmission stay exactly as they are. The exterior stays mostly stock, with maybe some subtle improvements to the exhaust system. The result, if it comes together, would be what the enthusiast community calls pro touring, a vintage-bodied car with contemporary performance, suspension, and braking capability. The kind of car that looks like it belongs in 1971, but drives like something built last year. Whether that vision gets executed on this particular wagon, whether Tony ultimately takes it home and makes his own choices, or whether it stays and gets built into something more, is a question that's still open. This is the part of these stories where I'm supposed to wrap it all up with a neat conclusion. Tell you what we learned.
Give you the takeaway.
Here's what I actually learned or relearned, because these lessons have a way of needing to be relearned every time. Sitting kills cars. Not quickly. Not dramatically, but surely, and with a thoroughness that is sometimes shocking to discover. The fuel goes bad. The rubber deteriorates. The moisture finds its way in. A car that runs perfectly when it's parked will not run perfectly a year later, and a car that ran great 2 years ago is a different machine than the one you pull out of storage today. Expect this. Plan for it. Don't let it surprise you. Conversely, old Detroit iron is tough. This wagon sat in a horse stall for over a year, got drenched and abandoned and covered in webs and forgotten, and within a day of attention, a new battery, some fresh fuel, a fuel line swap. It was running. Not perfectly, but running. The engineering that went into these cars in the late 1960s and early 1970s was overbuilt in ways that benefit us enormously today. These were not delicate machines. And maybe the most important thing, the cars that nobody fights over are often the most interesting ones to live with. While everyone else is writing blank checks for Tri-5 Chevys and split-window Corvettes and big-block Chevelle coupes, the wagon is sitting over here at a fraction of the price with all the same mechanical goodness and a cargo area big enough to haul your project parts home from the swap meet. There's a lot more road left in this old station wagon. It's been rescued once. Whether it gets fully revived, sorted out, properly built, turned into the pro touring classic it could become, is a story still being written. But at least now it runs. And sometimes, that's exactly where the best stories start.